October 21, 1600. A valley shrouded in autumn mist. Over 160,000 samurai warriors gathered on the plains of Sekigahara, divided between two massive armies that would decide Japan's fate in a single, catastrophic day. This wasn't just a battle, it was a chess game played with human lives, where loyalty could be purchased with promises, where centuries-old alliances crumbled in moments, and where one man's betrayal could reshape an entire nation. The greatest samurai battle royale in history was about to begin, and by sunset, the blood of thousands would water the fields while one man emerged to rule Japan for the next 2.5 centuries. The morning fog that blanketed Sekigahara Valley seemed to absorb sound itself, creating an eerie silence that pressed against the eardrums of 160,000 warriors. They stood in formation, their armor still wet with dew, breath misting in the cold October air. On the western heights, Ishida Mitsunari surveyed his forces with eyes that betrayed neither fear nor confidence, only the cold calculation of a man who had wagered everything on this single day. Ishida Mitsunari had not been born a warrior. Unlike the battle-scarred generals who surrounded him, he had risen through bureaucratic brilliance, not martial prowess. His hands, though now calloused from months of desperate preparation, were better suited to the brush than the sword. Yet here he stood, commander of the Western Army, orchestrating what he believed would be the greatest victory in Japanese history. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 months ago, he had been one of the 5 regents appointed by the late Toyotomi Hideyoshi to govern Japan until his young son, Hideyori, came of age. Now he was a rebel, branded a traitor by some, a loyalist by others. The truth, as always in war, was far more complicated. Tokugawa Ieyasu had forced this confrontation. The old fox, for that's what everyone called him, had systematically dismantled the coalition of regents, playing them against each other with the skill of a master strategist. Political marriages here, strategic appointments there, whispered promises in the right ears. One by one, the other regents had fallen into his orbit or been neutralized. Only Mitsunari had possessed the courage, or perhaps the foolishness, to stand against him. "My lord, the scouts report that Tokugawa's vanguard is moving into position," announced Shima Sakon, Mitsunari's most trusted general. The man was a tactical genius, renowned throughout Japan for his defensive strategies. If anyone could counter Tokugawa's overwhelming reputation, it was Sakon. Ishida Mitsunari nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the valley below. He had chosen this battlefield carefully. The narrow plain was flanked by mountains, limiting maneuverability and negating some of Tokugawa's numerical advantage. More importantly, he had secured promises from several key daimyo who currently stood with the Eastern Army. When the moment came, they would turn their banners, surrounding Tokugawa in a trap from which there could be no escape. "And Kobayakawa?" Mitsunari asked, referring to Kobayakawa Hideaki, the young daimyo whose 15,000 men held the crucial position on Mount Matsuo, overlooking the battlefield. Sakon hesitated. "He maintains his position, my lord, but..." "But what?" "The men report he has not acknowledged our signals this morning. His camp was quiet through the night." A flicker of concern crossed Mitsunari's face, quickly suppressed. Kobayakawa was young, barely 20, known more for his dissolute lifestyle than his military acumen. But his adopted father had been none other than Hideyoshi himself, making him one of the most powerful daimyo in Western Japan. His position on the heights was the linchpin of Mitsunari's entire strategy. "Send another messenger," Mitsunari ordered. "Remind him of his obligations to the Toyotomi cause. Remind him that it was Hideyoshi who raised him from nothing." As Sakon departed to carry out the order, Mitsunari allowed himself a moment of doubt. War was never certain. Even the best-laid plans could unravel in the chaos of battle. But he had to believe in his strategy, in his alliance, in the righteousness of his cause.
Tokugawa Ieyasu was a usurper, a schemer who had betrayed the dying wish of Hideyoshi to protect his young son. If Mitsunari failed today, Japan would fall under the rule of a tyrant. The sound of conch shells echoed across the valley, signaling the Eastern Army's advance. Mitsunari straightened, pushing doubt from his mind. Today would be remembered as the day the bureaucrat became a warrior, or the day he died, trying. Across the valley, on the eastern heights, Tokugawa Ieyasu sat upon his camp stool with the calm of a man who had already won. At 58, he was ancient by samurai standards, having survived more battles, betrayals, and political intrigues than most men could imagine. His face was weathered like old leather, his body thick with the accumulated scars of 5 decades of warfare. Yet his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing. "The Western Army has over 120,000 men, my lord," reported Honda Tarakatsu, one of Tokugawa's 4 heavenly kings, legendary warriors who had served him since youth. "Our intelligence confirms that Mitsunari has secured strong positions on the heights. It will be a difficult fight." Ieyasu smiled, a thin expression that never reached his eyes. "Mitsunari thinks like an accountant, not a warrior. He has counted his soldiers, but not measured their hearts." It was true that Tokugawa's Eastern Army numbered only about 75,000 men, a significant disadvantage in raw numbers. But Ieyasu had not spent 50 years navigating Japan's treacherous political waters without learning that loyalty in war was a commodity to be bought, not assumed. 3 months ago, Ieyasu had sent secret emissaries to several key members of the Western coalition. To Kobayakawa Hideaki, he had promised vast territories in western Japan and the prestige of victory. To Akisuka Yasuharu, Ogawa Sukadara, Akaza Naoyasu, and Kuchiki Mototsuna, 4 daimyo whose forces held key positions in Mitsunari's battle plan, he had offered pardons, rewards, and the assurance that their families would be spared regardless of the battle's outcome. These men now stood with the Western Army, their banners displaying apparent loyalty to Mitsunari, their soldiers in position to execute his careful strategy. But when the critical moment came, they would turn, not out of ideology or loyalty to any cause, but because Ieyasu had made them an offer that their survival instincts couldn't resist. "What of our own forces?" Ieyasu asked. "Are they ready?" "Naomasa's Red Devils are eager to draw first blood, as always," Honda replied with a slight smile. The Red Devils were legendary, an elite force of cavalry renowned for their crimson armor and fearless charges. And Fukushima Masanari has the vanguard position as promised. Fukushima Masanari, another piece on Ieyasu's board. Technically, Fukushima was one of Mitsunari's allies, one of the Western daimyo who should have stood against Tokugawa. But Mitsunari had made a critical error. He had insulted Fukushima in a prior political dispute, questioning his courage in front of other daimyo. Pride, Ieyasu knew, was far more powerful a motivator than loyalty to distant causes. Fukushima had secretly contacted Ieyasu months ago, offering to lead the Eastern Army's vanguard in exchange for revenge against Mitsunari and confirmation of his territories. Ieyasu had agreed immediately. Nothing was more valuable than an enemy general who believed he was settling a personal score while actually serving your strategic interests. "Then we proceed as planned," Ieyasu said, rising from his stool. Despite his age, he moved with surprising grace, his hand resting naturally on his sword. "Signal the advance. Let Mitsunari see what he expects to see. An Eastern Army attacking his prepared positions. He will believe himself winning until the moment he realizes he has already lost." The conch shells sounded again, their deep notes reverberating across the valley. The Battle of Sekigahara was beginning, but in truth, It had been won and lost in the quiet negotiations of the preceding months, in promises whispered and coins exchanged, in the understanding that in the crucible of war, loyalty was the first casualty. As the armies began to move, a young samurai named Tanaka Yoshimasa stood in the ranks of the Western Army's center, his heart pounding against his chest plate. He was 18, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, and this was his first real battle. His father had died serving the Toyotomi clan at the siege of Osaka, and Yoshimasa had trained his entire life for this moment, to honor his family name, to prove his worth, to become a true samurai. He glanced at the men around him, veterans mostly, their faces hard with experience, their hands steady on their weapons. They had seen battle before, survived the chaos and terror of men killing men. Yoshimasa envied their calm as he struggled to control the trembling in his legs. "Steady, boy," said the man next to him, a grizzled warrior named Hashimoto. "The waiting is worse than the fighting. Once it starts, your body takes over. Just remember your training and stay in formation." Yoshimasa nodded, not trusting his voice. In the distance, he could see the Eastern Army beginning to move, a vast sea of mennon and banners flowing across the valley floor. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Thousands upon thousands of warriors, all dedicated to killing him and everyone around him. The battle began with a thunderous crash as Fukushima Masanori's vanguard collided with the Western Army's forward positions. Despite being nominally part of the Western coalition, Fukushima fought with savage intensity, driving his men forward with the fury of personal vendetta. His target was clear: any position held by Mitsunari's direct forces. "Push forward! Show these bureaucrats what real warriors look like!" Fukushima roared, his sword already red with blood. His men responded with a battle cry that echoed across the field, surging into the Western lines with devastating force. From his command position, Mitsunari watched the assault with growing concern. He had expected Fukushima to be half-hearted in his attack, perhaps even to defect openly once battle was joined. Instead, the man was fighting like a demon possessed. "This doesn't make sense," Mitsunari muttered. "Why would he?" His question was answered by a messenger who arrived breathless, his face pale with shock. "My lord, Fukushima Masanori is fighting under Tokugawa's banner. He has joined the Eastern Army." The words hit Mitsunari like a physical blow. Fukushima's defection wasn't just a loss of troops, it was a psychological hammer strike against the Western Army's morale. If one of their own daimyo could turn so brazenly, who else might betray them? "Stabilize that flank," Mitsunari ordered, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Send Shima-sakon with reinforcements. We cannot let them break through." But even as his orders were carried out, Mitsunari felt the first tendrils of doubt. His carefully constructed alliance was already showing cracks, and the battle had barely begun. Shima-sakon rode to the front lines with 5,000 men, his face set in grim determination. He had warned Mitsunari about trusting too many allied daimyo, about the danger of assuming loyalty in a world where survival often trumped honor. But Mitsunari had been convinced that the righteousness of their cause would hold the coalition together. "Form ranks," Sakon shouted as his forces moved into position. "Arquebusiers to the front, prepare volley fire." The introduction of firearms had revolutionized samurai warfare, though many traditionalists still viewed them with disdain. Sakon had no such prejudice. A weapon was a tool, and tools were to be used effectively. He had trained his gunners extensively, creating disciplined firing lines that could devastate charging enemies. "First rank, fire!" The crack of arquebus fire split the air, and dozens of Fukushima's men fell, their armor no protection against the lead balls. The charge faltered, men stumbling over the bodies of their comrades. "Second rank, fire!" Another volley, another wave of death. Fukushima's assault ground to a halt, his men taking cover behind the terrain as smoke from the gunpowder drifted across the battlefield like fog. For a moment, Sakon allowed himself to hope. If they could hold here, if they could maintain their defensive positions while waiting for Kobayakawa to sweep down from Mount Matsuo and crush Tokugawa's flank, victory was still possible. Then, everything changed. From the Western Army's rear positions, 4 daimyo suddenly raised new banners. Wakisaka Yasuharu, Ogawa Suketada, Akaza Naoyasu, and Kuchikimoto Tsuna, holding a combined 15,000 men in crucial positions, declared for Tokugawa. In an instant, they turned their weapons on their former allies, attacking Mitsunari's forces from behind. The betrayal was devastating. Western Army units, already engaged with the enemy to their front, suddenly found themselves attacked from the rear. Formations collapsed. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder moments before now killed each other in confusion and panic. A young Tanaka Yoshimasa found himself in the nightmare. One moment he was advancing with his unit towards the Eastern Army lines. The next, arrows were falling among them from behind, and the banners of Allied forces were attacking his position. "Betrayal! We're betrayed!" someone screamed. The formation dissolved into chaos. Yoshimasa saw Hashimoto, the veteran who had tried to calm his nerves, take an arrow through the throat and fall gurgling to the ground. Men ran in all directions, some trying to form defensive positions, others simply fleeing the killing field. An Eastern Army samurai appeared before Yoshimasa, sword raised. Training took over. Yoshimasa's blade came up, deflected the strike, countered with a cut that opened the man's side. His opponent fell, and Yoshimasa stared in shock at the blood on his sword. His first kill, achieved in a moment of pure instinct. There was no time to process it. Another enemy came, and another. Yoshimasa fought like a cornered animal, his earlier fear burned away by the simple imperative to survive. Around him, the battle had become a chaotic melee, units mixing and intermingling, the careful tactics of generals reduced to thousands of individual duels to the death. From Mount Matsuo, Kobayakawa Hideaki watched the battle unfold with a sick feeling in his stomach. He was 20 years old, had been given command of 15,000 men, and was being asked to make a decision that would determine the fate of Japan. The weight of it was crushing. Mitsunari's messengers had been arriving all morning, each more frantic than the last, begging him to attack the Eastern Army's flank as planned. It was the decisive move that would turn the battle, the hammer strike that would crush Tokugawa between his forces and the Western Army. But Tokugawa's messengers had been coming too, offering incredible rewards if he would instead attack Mitsunari. Vast territories, political power, the gratitude of the next shogun, everything a young daimyo could want. More than that, they had made clear what would happen if he remained loyal to Mitsunari. If the Western Army lost, and Tokugawa's representatives seemed supremely confident they would, Kobayakawa's family would be destroyed, his lands confiscated, his name erased from history. Kobayakawa's hands trembled as he gripped his war fan. He had been raised by Hideyoshi, owed everything to the Toyotomi clan. But Hideyoshi was dead, and the world had moved on. In the cold calculus of power, sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford.
"My lord," said his senior retainer, an old warrior named Inaba, "Mitsunari's forces are collapsing. The battle is reaching its critical moment. You must decide."
Kobayakawa looked down at the battlefield. He could see the chaos caused by the betrayals, the Western Army struggling to maintain cohesion. If he attacked now, attacked the Eastern Army as planned, he might still turn the tide. Mitsunari's strategy had been sound. It was only the betrayals that had undermined it. But those betrayals proved the point, didn't they? Loyalty was a myth. Everyone was making their own calculations, choosing their own survival. Why should he be the fool who threw away everything for a cause that was already dying? "Prepare the men," Kobayakawa said quietly.
We attack the Western Army." Inaba's face remained impassive, but Kobayakawa saw the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. The old man had served Hideyoshi faithfully, and this decision would haunt him, but he would follow orders, as samurai always did. On the battlefield, Mitsunari finally saw Kobayakawa's forces beginning to move down Mount Matsuo. For one brief, desperate moment, he felt a surge of hope. Finally, the decisive blow, the hammer that would crush Tokugawa. Then he saw which direction the attack was headed. Kobayakawa's 15,000 samurai slammed into the Western Army's flank like an avalanche. Already reeling from the earlier betrayals, already fighting desperately on multiple fronts, Mitsunari's forces simply broke. Units that had held firm against frontal assaults dissolved when attacked from the side by men they had believed to be allies. The organized battle became a rout. "No," whispered Mitsunari, watching his army, his strategy, his cause, his dream disintegrate before his eyes. "No, no, no!" Shima Sako, still fighting at the front lines, saw the collapse and immediately understood what had happened. There would be no victory today, no vindication of Mitsunari's ideals, just death and defeat. But perhaps in defeat there could still be honor. "Mitsunari must escape," Sakun shouted to his officers. "The cause survives if he survives. Form a rear guard." Against all odds, against the tide of the battle itself, Sakon managed to pull together a force of loyal warriors. They formed a defensive position, a small island of resistance in a sea of chaos, and began a fighting retreat designed to buy Mitsunari time to escape the field. The Eastern Army, sensing victory, pressed their attack with renewed ferocity. Ii Naomasa's Red Devils, held in reserve until now, charged into the wavering Western lines with devastating effect. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Sakon fought like a demon, his sword never still, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. He took a bullet in the shoulder, ignored it, took a spear thrust through the thigh, kept fighting. His men rallied around him, inspired by his courage, knowing they were buying time with their lives. Finally, inevitably, the lines broke. Sakon took a musket ball to the chest and fell. His last sight, the red sun breaking through the morning mist, painting the battlefield in blood-colored light. Tanaka Yoshimasa survived by pure luck and the chaos of battle. When the rout began, he ran with everyone else, his only thought to escape the nightmare. He had lost his sword somewhere in the fighting, his armor was dented and blooded, and he had no idea where he was or where he was going. He stumbled into a small ravine, found himself alone for the first time in hours. The sounds of battle continued in the distance, screams, steel on steel, the crack of firearms, but here, in this small pocket of the world, there was temporary quiet. Yoshimasa collapsed against a tree, his body shaking with delayed terror and exhaustion. He had survived his first battle. Whether he would survive the day was another question entirely. The battle was over by early afternoon, though scattered fighting continued across the valley for hours. The Western Army had been utterly destroyed. Conservative estimates placed their casualties at over 30,000 men, with thousands more captured or scattered into the mountains. The Eastern Army's losses were a fraction of that, perhaps 4,000 dead, mostly from units that had engaged before the betrayal shifted the tide. Tokugawa Ieyasu rode slowly across the battlefield, his face expressionless as he surveyed the carnage. Bodies lay everywhere, piled in some places 3 deep. The grass was slick with blood.
the air thick with the smell of death. Crows were already gathering, their cries mixing with the moans of the wounded. "A decisive victory, my lord," Honda Tadakatsu said, riding beside him. "The Western coalition is destroyed. Japan is yours." "Japan is earned, not given," Ieyasu replied. "This battle was merely the beginning. We must consolidate power, eliminate remaining opposition, and establish legitimacy for the new shogunate. That will take time and careful maneuvering." They passed by a group of prisoners being assembled under guard. Among them, Ieyasu recognized several daimyo who had fought for Mitsunari. Their faces showed varying degrees of resignation, fear, and defiance. These men would need to be dealt with carefully. Some could be won over with clemency, their gratitude transforming them into loyal supporters. Others were too dangerous to leave alive, too committed to the old cause. "What of Kobayakawa?" Ieyasu asked. "He has requested an audience, my lord. His forces were crucial to the victory." "Then he shall have his reward." But there was no warmth in his voice. Kobayakawa had proven useful, but a man who betrayed once could betray again. He would need to be watched carefully, his power limited despite the promises made. Kobayakawa Hideaki knelt before Tokugawa Ieyasu in the main command tent, his head bowed in respect. Around them, the senior commanders of the Eastern Army stood witness, their faces carefully neutral. "You have done me a great service," Ieyasu said. "Your timely intervention ensured our victory and saved countless lives. For this I have my gratitude and the rewards promised." "I live only to serve, my lord," Kobayakawa replied, but his voice lacked conviction. They both knew the truth. This hadn't been about service or loyalty. It had been about survival and ambition. "You will retain your territories and receive additional lands as discussed, but I trust you understand that with reward comes responsibility. I will expect your unwavering loyalty in the years to come." The words were polite, but the threat was clear. Kobayakawa had shown himself to be a man who could be bought. That made him useful, but also unreliable. He would be kept close, where he could be monitored and controlled. "Of course, my lord. My life is yours." As Kobayakawa left the tent, Honda Tadakatsu leaned close to Ieyasu. "Do you trust him?" Ieyasu replied, "I trust him to act in his own self-interest. As long as I make certain his interests align with mine, that will be sufficient." Elsewhere on the battlefield, the grim work of dealing with prisoners continued. Many would be executed, those too prominent or too committed to the Western cause to be allowed to live. Others would be stripped of their lands and titles, but allowed to survive as common samurai or even peasants, their family lines effectively ended. It was brutal, but it was necessary. Ieyasu had not survived 50 years of warfare by being merciful to his enemies. The purge would be swift, thorough, and designed to eliminate any chance of future rebellion. The most wanted man in all of Japan was Ishida Mitsunari himself. He had managed to escape the battlefield, but search parties were already combing the countryside. There would be nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Ieyasu had given strict orders. Mitsunari was to be taken alive if possible. His execution would be public, theatrical, a message to all Japan about the price of opposing the new order. Mitsunari fled through the mountains with only 3 loyal retainers, all of them exhausted and wounded. They had been traveling for 2 days, living on what little food they could forage, sleeping in caves and abandoned shrines. Their armor had been discarded to aid speed, their banners burned to avoid identification. "My lord, we cannot continue like this," said one of the retainers, a young man named Tanaka. "We need food, shelter, time to plan our next move." Mitsunari knew he was right. But what plan could there be? The Western army was destroyed. His allies were dead, captured, or had betrayed him. The cause he had championed, protecting the Toyotomi clan, preventing Ieyasu's usurpation, was finished. "There is a village 3 reed north," Mitsunari said wearily. "We will seek shelter there, pay for discretion if we must." It was a mistake. The villagers, terrified of being associated with the losing side, reported Mitsunari's presence to the local magistrate. Within hours, Tokugawa's forces surrounded the small house where he had taken shelter. Mitsunari considered fighting, dying sword in hand like a proper samurai. But what would the point be? His death in this anonymous village would change nothing, mean nothing. If he was to die, perhaps he could at least use his execution to make one last statement, one last argument for the cause he believed in, even if it had failed. He walked out of the house with his hands raised, surrendering without resistance. The journey back to Osaka took a week. Mitsunari was placed in a cage on a cart, paraded through the towns and villages along the route, like a circus animal. People came out to stare at the man who had dared to challenge Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had raised the largest army in Japanese history and lost everything in a single day. Some threw rotten food, others simply stared in morbid curiosity. A few, particularly in the western regions that had supported him, showed quiet sympathy in their eyes, though none dared speak it aloud. Mitsunari endured it all with stoic dignity, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on the horizon. They could humiliate his body, but they could not touch his spirit or his conviction that what he had done was right, even if it had failed. Young Tanaka Yoshimasa had somehow made it back to his village, though he barely remembered the journey. He had walked for days, hiding from roving soldiers, begging food from sympathetic farmers. His family's small compound seemed both familiar and strange after the nightmare of Sekigahara. His mother wept when she saw him, grateful her son had survived while so many others had not. His younger sister stared at him with wide eyes, clearly seeing something different in the brother who had left home with such pride just weeks before.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Ishida Mitsunari's execution was held in Kyoto on November 6, 1600, barely 2 weeks after the battle. Tokugawa Ieyasu had arranged for it to be a public spectacle, held at the Rokujo riverbed, where tens of thousands could witness the fate of those who opposed the new order. 3 men were to be executed that day: Mitsunari himself, Konishi Yukinaga, a Christian daimyo who had been one of Mitsunari's key allies, and Ankokuji Eike, a warrior monk who had coordinated much of the Western coalition's strategy. They were the symbolic leaders of the resistance, and their deaths would mark the definitive end of the Western cause. The crowd that gathered was enormous. Some came out of genuine loyalty to the new regime, eager to see the traitors punished. Others came out of morbid curiosity. Still others came to witness history, understanding that this moment would echo through the generations. Tokugawa Ieyasu himself did not attend. He remained in Osaka Castle, conducting the political business of consolidating his victory. The execution required no oversight from him. Its message was clear enough without his presence. Mitsunari was led to the execution ground in chains. Despite his imprisonment and the hardships of the journey, he maintained his dignity, walking with his back straight and his head high. As a samurai of rank, he had been granted the privilege of seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, though the practical results would be the same. The executioner, a man named Yamada Asaemon, was one of the most renowned sword masters in Japan.
His role was to perform the kaishaku, the mercy stroke that would sever Mitsunari's head after he had cut his own abdomen, ending his suffering quickly and cleanly. Before the execution began, Mitsunari was given the opportunity to speak final words. He stepped forward, surveying the crowd with eyes that showed no fear, no regret, only a kind of wearied determination. "I am asked to confess my crimes," Mitsunari began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled masses. "My crimes were these. I remained loyal to my lord Toyotomi Hideyoshi and his son Hideyori. I opposed the ambition of a man who sought to seize power in violation of his oaths. I raised an army to defend the legitimate succession and the will of the late Taiko." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was not the speech of a man begging for mercy or admitting wrongdoing. This was defiance. "Some will say I failed," Mitsunari continued, "that my army was defeated, my strategy flawed, my alliances weak. All of this is true. But history will judge whether it was a crime to remain loyal in an age of betrayal, to fight for principle in a world of pragmatism." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd as if looking for someone specific, though whom no one knew. "To those who betrayed our cause, I say this. You gained lands and titles, but you lost something more valuable. You lost the certainty that you are men of honor. That doubt will follow you all your remaining days, and it will poison every victory you achieve." Even the guards shifted uncomfortably at these words. Many of the daimyo who had betrayed Mitsunari were present in the crowd, come to witness the final defeat of their former commander. The accusation hit home. "To those who remained loyal, who died at Sekigahara, fighting for our cause, I say this. Your sacrifice was not in vain. You proved that there are still samurai who value honor over survival, principle over advantage. In 100 years, in 200 years, when scholars speak of Sekigahara, they will remember you with respect and the betrayers with shame." It was powerful oratory, all the more effective for being delivered by a man minutes from death. Some in the crowd were moved to tears. Others shifted angrily, uncomfortable being reminded of the moral complexity of what had occurred. And finally, to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was no doubt listening to these words even in his absence. "You have won the battle and will likely win the war. You will establish your shogunate and rule Japan, but you will never rule legitimately because your power was born of betrayal and will always carry that stain. Every daimyo in your service will know that loyalty can be bought, that oaths can be broken, that honor is negotiable. You have created a system where the only principle is survival. Perhaps that is enough for government, but it is not enough for greatness." With those final words, Mitsunari knelt on the execution mat, took the short blade offered to him, and prepared to perform seppuku. His hands did not shake as he gripped the knife. His face remained calm as he placed the blade against his abdomen. The cut was clean and deep, performed with the skill of a man who had prepared himself mentally for this moment. Blood flowed, but Mitsunari's face remained composed, almost serene. In that instant, Yamada Asayamon's blade flashed in the sunlight, and Ishida Mitsunari's head fell cleanly from his shoulders. The crowd fell silent. Whatever they had expected, screaming, begging, last-minute cowardice, they had not received it. Mitsunari had died as he had lived, with absolute conviction in his cause and unwavering dignity in the face of defeat. Konishi Yukinaga was next. As a Christian convert, he refused to perform seppuku, considering suicide a sin against his God. This caused some controversy among the officials, but ultimately he was simply beheaded. His final words were a prayer in Latin, incomprehensible to most of the audience, but carrying an otherworldly quality that left many unsettled. On Kokuji Eke, the warrior monk performed his seppuku with the calm detachment of a man who had spent his life meditating on the impermanence of existence. His final words were a Buddhist sutra, a reminder that all things, victory, defeat, life, death, were equally illusory. As the three bodies were removed and the crowd began to disperse, many felt a strange unease. They had come to witness the triumph of the new order, the punishment of traitors. But instead they had seen three men die with more dignity and conviction than most people showed in life. It was not the clear-cut moral victory that Tokugawa's propaganda machine had promised.
That night, lying in his own bed for the first time since the battle, Yoshimasa found he could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the chaos of the battlefield, felt the terror of combat, heard the screams of dying men. He had survived, but at what cost? And for what purpose? The Western army was destroyed. The cause he had believed in was defeated. Mitsunari, who he had never met, but had revered as a loyal servant of the Toyotomi clan, was captured and would surely be executed. Everything Yoshimasa had been taught to value, loyalty, honor, service to one's lord, seemed hollow now. "What do I do now?" he whispered to the darkness. The darkness, as always, had no answer. Kobayakawa Hideaki sat alone in his quarters, sake cup in hand, staring at nothing. He had achieved everything he had wanted. His territories were secure, his wealth increased, his position at the new power structure assured. He was one of the great daimyo of Japan, a man of consequence and power. So why did he feel so empty? The image of Shimasakan's last stand haunted him. That old warrior had known the battle was lost, had known that resistance was futile. Yet he had fought anyway. Had sacrificed himself to buy time for Mitsunari's escape, had chosen death over dishonor. Kobayakawa had made the opposite choice. He had chosen survival over honor, pragmatism over loyalty, and he had been richly rewarded for it by any objective measure. But late at night, when the sake wore off and sleep would not come, he wondered which man had actually won. Sakan, who died for a losing cause, or Kobayakawa, who lived after betraying everything he had been taught to value. He poured another cup and tried not to think about it. Among the crowd stood Tanaka Yoshimasa, who had traveled to Kyoto specifically to witness this moment. He had survived Sekigahara, had returned to his village, but found he could not simply resume his old life. The battle had changed him fundamentally, and he needed to understand what it had all meant. Watching Mitsunari's execution, seeing the man's unshakable conviction even in death, Yoshimasa felt something shift inside him. He had spent the weeks since the battle questioning everything he believed about honor, loyalty, and the samurai way. But Mitsunari's death had provided an answer of sorts. There were still men of principle in the world. They didn't always win, in fact, they usually lost, but they existed. And perhaps their existence mattered more than their victories. Yoshimasa turned and walked away from the execution ground, his path uncertain, but his spirit somehow lighter than it had been in weeks. In Osaka Castle, Tokugawa Ieyasu received word of the executions with a simple nod. 3 obstacles removed, 3 symbols of resistance eliminated. It was necessary work, nothing more. What of the other prisoners? Most have submitted and sworn loyalty to you, my lord. A few remain defiant and have been executed. The process is nearly complete. Good. And Kobayakawa? Honda's face darkened slightly. He has been troubled, my lord. Reports suggest he drinks heavily and has become erratic. Some question whether he can manage the territories you've granted him. Ieyasu considered this. Kobayakawa's betrayal of Mitsunari had been crucial to victory at Sekigahara, but the young daimyo was proving to be unstable. A man consumed by guilt was potentially dangerous, unpredictable, unreliable. "Continue to monitor him," Ieyasu ordered. "If he becomes a problem, we will deal with it. For now, he serves as a useful reminder to others of the rewards of choosing the winning side." What Ieyasu didn't say, but both men understood, was that Kobayakawa also served as a reminder of the cost of betrayal. The young daimyo was wealthy and powerful, but clearly miserable. That too sent a message. Even in victory, betrayal carried a price. The months following Sekigahara saw Ieyasu systematically consolidate his control over Japan. The emperor formally appointed him as shogun in 1603, legitimizing his rule. One by one, the remaining centers of resistance were eliminated or absorbed. The Toyotomi clan was allowed to survive but was politically neutered, confined to Osaka Castle with no real power. The system Ieyasu established would last for over 250 years, the Tokugawa shogunate, also known as the Edo period. It brought unprecedented peace and stability to Japan, ending the centuries of warfare that had defined the Sengoku period. Cities flourished, arts and culture bloomed, the economy grew. But it came at a cost. The rigid social hierarchy, the suppression of Christianity, the policy of national isolation, all were parts of the Ieyasu's vision for a stable, controllable Japan. It was peace through control, stability through restriction. In 1602, barely 2 years after Sekigahara, Kobayakawa Hideaki died suddenly at the age of 21. The official cause was illness, but rumors circulated of suicide or assassination. His death was convenient for Tokugawa, eliminating a potentially unstable element and allowing the redistribution of his territories to more reliable allies. Those who had known Kobayakawa said he had never recovered from the guilt of his betrayal. Despite his wealth and status, he had been a haunted man, drinking himself into oblivion most nights, waking from nightmares about Sekigahara. In the end, whether by his own hand or another's, death had come as a release. The other betrayers of Sekigahara fared better in practical terms. They kept their lands and positions, but their reputations were forever tainted. Japanese historians would debate Sekigahara for centuries, and while some praised the betrayer's pragmatism, many more condemned their dishonor. Mitsunari's final speech had proven prophetic. They had gained the world, but lost something essential to their identity as samurai.
15 years after Sekigahara, Tanaka Yoshimasa stood on a hill overlooking the valley where the battle had occurred. He was 33 now, a man in his prime, but the memories of that day remained vivid. The chaos, the terror, the betrayals, the blood. He had not returned to Sekigahara since the battle. After witnessing Mitsunari's execution, he had wandered Japan for several years, a ronin without master or purpose. He had studied under various sword masters, learned the tea ceremony, practiced meditation at mountain temples. He had been searching for something, though he couldn't have said what. Eventually, he had found service with a minor daimyo in northern Japan, far from the politics of the capital. It was quiet work, mostly administrative, training young samurai in the fundamentals of combat. It wasn't glorious, but it was honest, and Yoshimasa had learned to value honesty over glory. The valley was peaceful now. Farmers worked the fields where armies had once clashed. Children played near the stream that had run red with blood. Nature had reclaimed the battlefield, covering the scars with new growth. But for those who had been there, who had survived that day, the scars remained. "You were there, weren't you?" asked a voice behind him. Yoshimasa turned to find an old man, a farmer by his clothing, regarding him with knowing eyes. "I was," Yoshimasa admitted. "Western Army. I was 18. The farmer nodded slowly. "I saw the battle from that ridge," he said,
pointing. "I was just a boy, but I remember. The banners, the noise, the betrayals. We all knew when Kobayakawa turned. You could hear the roar of confusion from here." "It changed everything," Yoshimasa said quietly. "Did it?" the farmer asked. "We have peace now. The Tokugawa rule is strong. Maybe those betrayals, terrible as they were, brought something good." It was a question Yoshimasa had wrestled with for 15 years. Was a peace built on betrayal still valuable? Could stability justify dishonor? Were pragmatic victories worth more than principled defeats? "I don't know," Yoshimasa admitted. Mitsunari died believing his cause was just. Ieyasu lives believing his victory was necessary. Who can say which man was right? "Maybe they both were," the farmer suggested. "Maybe they both were wrong. The land doesn't care about human philosophies. It just goes on, season after season, regardless of who rules or why." It was a peasant's wisdom, practical and grounded, and it struck Yoshimasa more deeply than all the sophisticated philosophies he had studied. They stood together in silence, watching the sun set over the valley where 16,000 men had once gathered to determine Japan's fate. The light painted the fields gold, beautiful and indifferent to the history beneath. In Edo, the new capital Tokugawa had established, Ieyasu was dying. He was 73, ancient by any standard, and his body was finally failing after a lifetime of warfare and political struggle. He had achieved everything he set out to accomplish, unified Japan under his rule, established a dynasty that would last centuries, brought peace to a war-torn land. But late at night, when the pain in his stomach kept him awake and the doctors could do nothing but offer useless herbs, Ieyasu sometimes thought about Sekigahara. Not the victory itself, which had been inevitable once he had secured the betrayals, but the cost of that victory. He had built a system where loyalty was bought rather than earned, where honor was subordinate to pragmatism, where the only reliable principle was self-interest carefully managed. It was effective, remarkably so. But was it good? Mitsunari's final words haunted him sometimes. "You will never rule legitimately because your power was born of betrayal and will always carry that stain." Was it true? Did it matter? The Tokugawa shogunate was strong, prosperous, stable. The people had peace. Wasn't that enough? "My lord," Handa Tarakatsu's voice interrupted his thoughts. The old warrior was also aging, his once mighty frame bent with the years. "The physicians say you should rest." "Rest," Ieyasu said with a bitter laugh. "I'll have eternity to rest soon enough." He looked at Honda, his oldest companion, the man who had fought beside him for 50 years. "Tell me honestly, old friend, was it worth it? All of it?" Honda considered the question seriously, as he always did. "You achieved what you set out to achieve. Japan is unified and at peace. Your descendants will rule for generations. By any measure, you succeeded." "That's not what I asked." Honda met his lord's eyes. "I don't know if I can answer what you're really asking. Whether the means justify the ends is a question for philosophers and priests. I am only a warrior. I followed you because I believed in you, and I still do." It was not the profound answer Ieyasu had hoped for, but perhaps it was the only honest one possible. Tokugawa Ieyasu died in June 1616, 16 years after Sekigahara. His death was mourned throughout Japan, and his legacy as the great unifier who brought peace to the realm was firmly established. History would remember him as one of Japan's greatest leaders, the founder of a shogunate that brought stability and prosperity. But history would also remember the betrayals at Sekigahara, and debate would continue for centuries about whether his victory was a triumph of pragmatism or a lesson in the cost of abandoning principle.
250 years after Sekigahara, in 1850, a young scholar named Takahashi Kenji stood in the Tokugawa Library in Edo, studying documents from the Great Battle. The Tokugawa shogunate still ruled, though it was showing signs of age and strain. Western powers were pressing at Japan's borders, demanding trade and modernization. Change was coming, whether Japan was ready or not. Kenji had become fascinated with Sekigahara while studying military history. The battle was endlessly analyzed, the tactics, the betrayals, the decisive moments. But what intrigued him most were the moral questions that still resonated across the centuries. He'd found letters written by participants in the battle, diaries kept by samurai who had survived, official records of the executions. Through these documents, the people of Sekigahara came alive, not as historical figures or strategic pieces, but as human beings facing impossible choices. There was Ishida Mitsunari, the idealistic bureaucrat who had believed that loyalty and principle could triumph over pragmatism. He had been wrong, but his final speech at his execution had ensured that history would remember him with respect, even admiration. There was Kobayakawa Hideaki, the young daimyo, crushed by the weight of his betrayal, dead at 21 from guilt and despair. A cautionary tale about the cost of pragmatism without principle. There were the countless ordinary samurai like Tanaka Yoshimasa, who had survived the battle but carried its scars forever, who had spent their lives trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with what they believed about honor and duty. And there was Tokugawa Ieyasu himself, the great pragmatist who had won everything but seemed, in his final days, to question whether victory alone was enough. "What did you learn?" asked Kenji's teacher, an old scholar named Watanabe, who had spent his life studying the Sengoku period. "I learned that Sekigahara wasn't really about tactics or military strategy," Kenji replied slowly. "It was about the fundamental question of how we should live. Should we be pragmatic or principled? Should we prioritize survival or honor? Should we accept the world as it is or fight for the world as it should be? And what is your answer?" Kenji smiled. "I don't think there is a single answer. Mitsunari and Ieyasu both made choices that made sense from their perspectives. Both paid prices for those choices. The tragedy is that they couldn't both be right, so one had to destroy the other." Watanabe nodded approvingly. "You were beginning to understand. History is not a simple morality tale with heroes and villains. It is complicated, messy, full of people making difficult choices with incomplete information and competing values. Sekigahara matters not because it gives us easy answers, but because it asks us the hard questions." "Do you think the Tokugawa shogunate was the right outcome?" The old scholar looked troubled. "It brought peace and stability for 2.5 centuries, but it also created rigidity, suppressed change, isolated Japan from the world. Now we face Western powers with technologies and ideas we don't understand,
And we are unprepared because the Tokugawa system prioritized control over adaptation. He gestured to the documents spread before them. Perhaps if Mitsunari had won, Japan would have developed differently. Perhaps worse, perhaps better. We cannot know. What we can know is that the choices made at Sekigahara echo through every generation since. In 1868, 18 years after this conversation, the Tokugawa shogunate would finally fall, ended by the Meiji Restoration. The system Ieyasu had built, sustained by the victory at Sekigahara, would give way to a new order. Japan would embrace modernization, becoming a major world power within decades. But the questions raised by Sekigahara would remain relevant. In World War II, Japanese soldiers would face similar dilemmas about loyalty, honor, and pragmatism. In the post-war period, Japanese society would continue to grapple with the tension between traditional values and practical necessities. Even today, the Battle of Sekigahara remains a subject of fascination in Japan. Books, movies, video games, and academic studies continued to explore the battle and its meaning. School children visit the battlefield on field trips, learning about the betrayals and the decisive moment that shaped their nation. The site where Ishida Mitsunari commanded his forces has a memorial. Visitors leave offerings and reflect on the man who lost everything fighting for a cause he believed in. Similarly, there are memorials for Shima Sakan and others who died with honor. Interestingly, there are fewer memorials for the betrayers, though their contributions to the victory were crucial. History has been less kind to them, validating Mitsunari's prediction that their names would carry a stain even as their descendants enjoyed the rewards of their choices.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.